It was a dark and stormy night. We've heard those words before. Where did you first hear those words? That's same here. Snoopy, of course, the great beagle, Charlie Brown's beagle, who fought the Red Baron in the great aerial dogfight, imaginary aerial dogfights, sitting on top of his doghouse. Also was apparently a great novelist. He began many stories in that comic strip with, "It was a dark and stormy night." However, that isn't where that phrase came from. I had to look it up. I didn't know where it came from. It first was written in 1830 in a novel by Edward Bulwer Lytton. The novel is called Paul Clifford, and it opens like this. "It was a dark and stormy night. The rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals, when it was checked by a violent gust of wind which swept up the streets, for it is in London that our scene lies, rattling along the housetops and fiercely agitating the scanty flame of the lamps that struggled against the darkness." Now, Bulwer's words might invoke a horrible, dark and stormy night of storm. Some literary critics also call it purple prose, which is language that's so flowery it calls attention to itself instead of to the scene itself. But it reminds me, that whole idea of a dark and stormy night, of Mark's scene here in the gospel. And in verse 37, we get the best description of this scene. "A great windstorm arose, and the waves were beating against the boat, and the boat was already being swamped." Now, you know what a boat being swamped looks like? This is great to talk about a passage like this in a place like this, because almost everyone here is a mariner in some form or fashion, or at least has been around it. But a boat is swamped when what? What? Water does what? Over the gunnel, it comes bow, or anything. When the water comes up and over, and so they're out in this wooden boat. Now, a lot of modern boats have positive flotation, so you could, the advertisement goes, you could saw it in half, and both halves would just float in the water. I don't know anybody who has a Boston whaler who's tried that, but after paying for one, probably not want to saw it in half. But in this day and age, when Jesus is in this boat going across the lake to the other side, they didn't necessarily have positive flotation. And so being swamped means if it continues to take in water, the inevitable, it will be completely succumb to the watery depths. So you can imagine the scene of great terror as the waves are already breaking over the side of the boat, and the wind is come up. Living here in the bay is a great place to imagine this, because the summer storms that come up on the bay are fairly sudden, and they're incredibly violent. That was one of my early introductions to the Chesapeake Bay. Years ago, before living here, I was sailing on the bay, and I think the forecast was 30% chance of some afternoon thunderstorms. And so we were set off on our trip, and everything was beautiful. And then just out of nowhere, violent wind and big waves, and it was incredible. It was quite an introduction to the bay. Literature is full of these images of great and powerful storms. One of my very favorites comes from Edgar Allan Poe and his tale, A Descent into the Maelstrom. And the maelstrom is this, it actually exists. There are these funnels that occur in northern latitudes, sort of whirlpools that occur. They don't actually occur the way that Poe records it. Poe's maelstrom was like 3 miles across and would suck ships to the bottom of the ocean. And so in the story, he's encountering this fisherman who had survived an encounter with the maelstrom. And so the fisherman says to him, "You suppose me a very old man, but I am not. It took less than a single day to change these hairs from jetty black to white." to weaken my limbs and unstring my nerves, so that I tremble at the least exertion and am frightened at a shadow. The man had been transformed by this encounter with the great power of the sea. And that's what we have. The disciples in this passage are terrified. They're utterly terrified. Some are bailing. I did a Google search for Jesus calms the storm, or some phrase like that on Google Images. And I came across Rembrandt's Jesus Calming the Storm. And it's an amazing image. There's so much you could do with it. Interpretation. Some of these great Renaissance masters do so much with these stories from the Bible. But the boat is at a very awkward angle, upward pitched. And the waves are just, the white foam is across the bow. And you look around the boat at the disciples, and they're all some are holding on for dear life. In the very back and the stern, near where Jesus is Jesus looks totally placid. He's just kind of laid back. There's one hanging over the side. I can only imagine what he's doing. Was it feeding the fish? Chum. And so, we get so many images that can help us imagine the actual feeling that they've encountered in this storm, in this horrible storm. Some are rowing, and some are trying to trim the sails. They're doing anything to get out of this dark and stormy night. Jesus was asleep, or at least that's what the Bible tells us. They find him curled up, relaxed, and in the stern of the boat, the back of the boat. This is not a bad place to be, because in these big waves, as the boat rides over them, the bow is the worst place. It pitches up and down with great force. I was sent up to the bow during an offshore sailboat race one time for a sail change. That was my job. I was one of the bowmen. And because I'm tall and I didn't bring a lot of weight to the bow, so that was why it was good to send somebody like me. I could reach things. As I was up there reaching up to get the spinnaker, the lazy guy off the spinnaker, we went into a wave, and it came. Every year the water gets higher, but I think it was thigh deep now. But it was blue water over the bow, and it was like, it was just so striking, because you're holding on, you're reaching, extending, and then all of a sudden you're standing in seawater, and then the bow comes up. And when it comes up with such force that you've got to flex your knees. And that's that constant force of flexing and relaxing in order to not just be thrown like a rag doll completely off the boat or around the boat. Jesus couldn't have probably been sleeping in the bow. But they find him sleeping in the stern. Being in a storm is hard enough. We've gone through literary images. Probably some of you are imagining your own experiences of being in a storm. But a storm in this passage is really more like a metaphor for the difficulties and the hardships and the things we encounter. How many times have we been in a storm in our lives, and we call out and we cry out to God, and we feel almost like there's no answer? I don't want to put words in your mouth. I don't want to put a thought in your head. And if your experience has been different, if you've never felt that, if you've never encountered calling out and feeling like nothing happens, that's wonderful. You've had an incredibly blessed life, and I mean that in all sincerity. However, my experience is that sometimes when all goes wrong and the waves are crashing around me, and I really don't know how it's going to play out. There's absolute uncertainty. And I cry out to God. I don't feel like I hear anything. There's no immediate answer or fix. Now sometimes there is. Sometimes there's a sense of peace. But sometimes I pray and feel alone. I pray and I hear nothing. I pray again. And then I feel like I've just discovered Jesus sleeping at the back of the boat. And Suddenly the words the disciples cry out to him feel like my own words. Don't you care, Jesus? Don't you care what I'm going through? We use these storms as metaphors, and it seems as though the storm serves as a metaphor of faithfulness in this passage. God is faithful and present, even when we don't realize it. Of course, storms take many different forms. They can be illness, insecurity, or isolation. They can be discontent, disillusionment, or disappointment. Storms can feel like pressure. Storms can feel like pain. They can feel like powerlessness. Storms can be loss, or loneliness, or lethargy. They can take so many different forms. It's hard to escape the reach of the storms in our lives. Just like the tentacles of Edgar Allan Poe's Maelstrom reaching out for the ships to draw them down. And there are those times when in the midst of those storms that we cry out, just like the disciples, and find Jesus asleep. Teacher, don't you care that we're about to perish? The water's already coming over the side, and this isn't a whaler. We don't have the positive flotation, Jesus. It's not going to be invented for nearly 1900 years. Dear God, don't you care what I'm going through? We reach out despite our doubt or the silence we hear when we call out to God. And then Jesus wakes up. And this is where we see the whole meaning of that hymn we just sang, have faith in God. He rebuked the wind and told the waves, peace, be still. And then it was calm. Sometimes God reaches out and answers our prayers through other people. Sometimes God can calm the storms of our lives using the people around us. I mentioned already that we're in the second part of our summer series looking at our church covenant and that agreement around which we have gathered as a community of believers. This is, if you recall from last week, covenant is an agreement, a divine and holy agreement, even one of sacredness. And our covenant has been with us since the inception of this church. That's who we are. And part of our covenant talks about in sickness and in distress. We could just as easily substitute the storms of life. When we're encountering those storms, we're not alone. We're with our covenant community. We're just like the disciples in the boat. They weren't alone. They were with each other. And they kept reaching out. They kept trying to rouse Jesus, wake him from his slumber, until they got his attention. I don't know if at some point Simon Peter said, "Wake him up." Bartholomew responds, "I tried already. Let's get back to bailing." And James and John, sons of thunder, said, "Do it again. Try." Or maybe they said, "Let's bail together. Maybe we can make some headway." Whatever it was, they were in a community together in that boat. And as we encounter storms in our lives, as we encounter things that confront us and seek to push us down, for whatever reason, we don't do it alone. We're a part of a community, and we don't do it in isolation from God. Sometimes it just requires an additional prayer to try to wake Jesus, get his attention. Have faith in God. He's on your side. Have faith in God. We continue to engage because despite that feeling of no answer, Jesus was in the boat all along. God is with us all along, no matter what we go through, no matter what we encounter. God is with us. God loves us very much. Will you bow your heads with me?